All right, welcome everyone to this webinar with Jessica Hooten Wilson, Dr. Jessica Hooten Wilson. Today, I'm really delighted and honored to get to talk to Jessica about her book, Learning the Good Life, learning from, I believe it's the wisdom of the great hearts and minds who came before. And it's such a delight to have you all with us today. We're going to have about 30 minutes of discussion between Jessica and me, and then there will be a period of Q&A after that. So please be thinking of questions and ideas and thoughts that you would like to share. So just a quick introduction to get us started. My name is Gracy Olmstead. I'm the author of a book called Uprooted: Recovering the Legacy of the Places We've Left Behind. And then I have a monthly newsletter called Granola that seeks to foster conversations about place, community, and books with thinkers and readers from a variety of faiths, political beliefs, and backgrounds. Jessica is a Louise Cowan Scholar in Residence at the University of Dallas. She is the author of 3 books prior to the 2 books that just came out this year, I believe. So there's Giving the Devil His Due, Flannery O'Connor and the Brothers Karamazov. There is Solzhenitsyn and American Culture, The Russian Soul in the West. And the 2 books that she has coming out right now, kind of together, are The Scandal of Holiness: Renewing Your Imagination in the Company of Literary Saints, and the book we'll be discussing today, Learning the Good Life. So Jessica, thank you so much for joining us. It's just a delight to have you.
Yes, thank you. This is actually my first conversation on this book because I've been doing so much scandal stuff, so it was great.
Awesome. Well, it's a delight to have you. And I thought just to kind of start, it would be really great to talk about what inspired this book and how you went about compiling it, because in it you have thoughts and essays and excerpts from poetry from just dozens and dozens of thinkers from all throughout human history.
So I was in the Great Text program at Pepperdine University, University of Dallas, and at Baylor. And so it's always been part of my understanding of what education looks like, that it is joining a conversation that started way before us and that we want to participate in, after we die, we're passing it on to the next generation. And so for me, that's always what education should be. But when I look at what first-year seminars are doing, and this is across colleges and universities, there was not a text that was succinct, that was accessible, in which faculty, no matter what discipline you were in, you could grab this book and say, okay, here's the great conversation. This is what we're entering. This is what I can invite students into. And so a colleague and I, Jake Stratman, who we were both at John Brown University, and we were looking for that kind of book for first year seminars. And, I founded a classical school, so I also knew the tradition that was coming up from that high school and then being invited into the college setting. And so we started putting one together, and we started gathering all of our friends and people who were teaching these texts in the classroom, and basically just approached it like, if you could teach one text, 3,000 words, and every single college student coming into university should read it, what would it be? And then just tell us why and give us that kind of intro opening to why they should read this. And so that's what ultimately comprised all the texts that are in here.
I love in your introduction to the book, you ask this question of why do you learn? And I would love to kind of start out by asking you the same question here. Why do we learn? What does the practice of studying, of learning mean to us as humans, and why does it matter?
I think it's, the big question, why do we learn? There's kind of the hidden question within it, which is, why do we intentionally learn? Because most of what we're doing all the time is we're being formed by the culture that we're in. So we're learning and being enculturated, but maybe without intention. And so college or K through 12, or even afterwards, if you're going to be intentional about learning, you have to consider what it is that you want to learn and what your telos is. Like, what does it mean to have this good life? So if we're going to learn intentionally towards crafting a good life and not just being pressed into the shape that the culture wants us to be in, then we really have to be contemplative. We have to think about what that end is, what that highest goal is, and how we're going to find the resources and the means and the teachers that are going to help move us that direction, so that we don't become something we don't want to be.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because you use the word contemplation there, and that to me really pulls together both the strands of learning as a discipline, a craft, a practice, and this idea of the good life, because you argue that we were made to be contemplatives. So, for people who might not be as familiar with the kind of different definitions of contemplation or the readings that have to do with kind of studying it, what is contemplation and why does it matter so much?
Yeah, let me address it by going a circuitous or backwards route for a second. So just follow me and I promise I'll get there. So when I would teach these year-long seminars in the Great Text, I would start the first day of class knowing that there's this elephant in the room where a bunch of the students don't know why they're there or why they're supposed to take that class. And so I would pass out note cards and I would say, "Okay, what's wrong with the world?" And without fail, the responses that would come back, I mean, they were always, they're variety of responses, like what's wrong with the world is poverty, what's wrong with the world is women's health, whatever meant something to that student that they were in college to go train for and be active and solve the problems in the world. And there would always be students saying, what's wrong with the world is that I have to be here discussing these ideas and this philosophy when I should be out there changing the world. And if you would just let me out of this classroom, give me my degree, and let me go change the world, I'll fix all the problems. And so I would have to, the reason I did that was to get all of the misconceptions about what education is, because they see it as a disconnect between the action that they wanted to be a part of and the contemplative life that was being forced on them in college. So what I was trying to do is say that these things actually work together. You cannot go out there and be a frenetic, restless, unanchored person in the world and do good for your neighbor, because you're going to end up not being able to really fully see the context. Like contemplation is going to give you the perspective on the context, on the history. You're going to be able to see people better. You're going to be able to see them more holistically, but you have to have a mind that loves wisdom, that understands how to have a more expansive vision, that can handle problems imaginatively and innovatively within the tradition that you're coming from, or within the tradition that the culture you're approaching came from. And if you don't have that kind of education, if you're not apprenticed in this wisdom, then you're probably going to create more problems without meaning to, because your good intentions are not going to be able to take the action that you need. And so I was always trying to set them up. That's what contemplation is. It's not abstract, it's not ethereal, it's not individualistic, it's not just floating off into the space and just sitting there. It's not a yogi on a mat. Like, it is a way of seeing in which action then becomes fruitful instead of merely energy being burned, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I love you have a excerpt from an essay by Simone Weil in the book, Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God, the very long title. And she writes something that's just really struck me. She says, it comes about that, paradoxical as it may seem, a Latin prose or a geometry problem, even though they are done wrong, may be of great service one day, provided we devote the right kind of effort to them. Should the occasion rise, they can one day make us better able to give someone in affliction exactly the help required to save him at the supreme moment of his need. Which, as you were talking just then about contemplation, it struck me, it's both that we receive kind of the historical, philosophical, spiritual context for issues we're facing, and that we begin to hopefully develop these practices that build a type of person who's oriented toward the right kinds of service even as well.
Yeah, I think there's so much of it. I love that quote. I mean, this is the reason I love this book, because most of what I'm saying, I can't even point to all the resources in what I'm saying. Does that make sense? Like, there's so many of these authors who have formed the way that I think and what I'm saying now, but without having read all of them, I couldn't even be able to speak. We couldn't have this conversation and it have any fruit in it, right? And so what Vey is talking about there is this kind of like muscle lifting that happens with character. It's a training in character that you can't pull it apart. You can't see exactly how all of this wisdom, all this philosophy, all of this literature has formed you directly, but it has. And we trust the process because the process has proved over time to be true.
Mm, yes, absolutely. I think it's really interesting to think too about how there's a quote I have excerpt from, I think, Jacob, is it Jacob's introduction or Jake? And he says, the kind of learner you become has something to do with the kind of person you become, and your basic beliefs shape how you learn, which basically brings us then to this question of religious belief and learning together and what it means to be a Christian learner. So I wondered if you could kind of answer that question or think through it with us, and perhaps for the non-Christian participant to consider what it means to be a wise and ethical learner as well.
Yeah. So, throughout the Christian tradition, wisdom is Christ, right? Like, O sapientia is like, oh, Christ, that is the source of all wisdom. So for traditions who want to, not equate those two, that's difficult for me because that's just the tradition that I'm in, is that's the ultimate end of wisdom is the person of Jesus Christ. And so our whole framework is this understanding that if that is wisdom that you're pursuing, well, that is an embodied life. It's not just an idea. And wisdom without being lived out is mere ideas. It's mere trivia, it's mere information if it's not being embodied in the practices, right? So if you're not living what you're learning, then what is the point, right? And so any education that doesn't take into account that you are in relationship and people are being formed and people are following those from the past and they're actually in community with one another, that education is lacking what it means to be a human being. And so a wise and ethical learner or a humane learner or a Christian learner, you're really emphasizing the humanness of the education process, and you're not turning people into something they're not, right? Either animals to be controlled or manipulated, or computers to be programmed. Human beings are neither one of those things. We're relational creatures who are in process and always becoming hopefully greater than we were the day before.
Hmm, absolutely. But it seems too that this process of training then requires a set of disciplines and practices, which so much of this book is about. And I feel like perhaps it's good at this point to address the question of, if this was prepared for students in a classroom, does it apply to people who are kind of outside of academia, people who no longer necessarily see themselves as first year students who would necessarily turn to a textbook? What does this book speak to a young mom, for instance, or to someone who's retired, or people kind of within those different areas of non-student life?
Mhm. Yeah, so when I first put this book together, I was very much imagining students, and so was Jake. And then as we were telling people about the book, there were several different audiences that were like, I'm going to get that book. One was moms, as you were talking about, or dads. It was these parents who wanted a different kind of education for their children than they themselves received, but they also wanted to be part of that education. They didn't want their kids learning about the Odyssey and they had no reference point, right? They wanted to know, what was the great conversation for? Because I didn't receive that, but also I work full time. I can't sit at home and read the Odyssey right now. What can I do? And so this text, I started telling parents, I'm like, well, grab this book, read an excerpt together as a family, and have these conversations. There's discussion questions. How much more rich would your table conversation be if this book was at the center of it, rather than whatever movie you just watched or whatever news story you just read? Like, it was about permanent things and something that's beautiful and something that's lasting. And then in that way, you get to participate in the same kind of education you're hoping for your children. So
Mhm.
parents were a big part of it. Also, a lot of teachers. So professional development, whether teachers in classical schools were teaching grammar and this is not what they're teaching, but they themselves have realized that the education they're leading their fourth graders towards, they too are not going to get to participate in. And so they wanted this kind of text for their own professional development to really think through, the life of the student that they're involved in at the fourth grade level. What is that life going to look like? How are they a part of that now? And how are they themselves going to be developed and be able to cultivate these things that they're telling the students to love? So teachers, as well as parents, also just those who are continuing to learn, right? I mean, the Catherine Project, my friend Zena started this thing where like you get to have classes on Kierkegaard at night for fun, without credit, without grades, none of that, just getting to learn the material because you love it and because you love these texts and they shouldn't be lost. Well, this book does the same thing. It kind of gives you the starting point. It gives you a taste of all these different texts, and then you can go deeper with whichever one you want to go deeper with.
Yes. Yeah, I loved that as I was reading through the book. In the introduction to Plato's Cave Allegory, Jason Bear writes that to learn what is truly real and good, our entire selves or souls must be oriented in the right direction. Knowledge worth having isn't simply deposited into our minds by our teachers. We must desire it, care about it, fight for it, and delight in it, which as I was reading, it strikes me as such a lifelong discipline, a lifelong process, and something that is easy to even lose along the way as you're busy with work or the day-to-day of changing diapers, whatever it may be.
Mhm.
And so having those reminders in this text, I found very refreshing, even for myself. In one of the excerpts, there's a portion of text from Nietzsche's Use and Abuse of History, where he differentiates between useless knowledge, rote memorization that creates what he calls knowledge stones that rattle together in the student's body, which I just loved, and an education in which students seek what it means to live, quote, authentically, creatively, and vigorously in the world. So how do these various thinkers perhaps critique or complicate more utilitarian understandings of the purpose of education?
Yeah, I think, almost everything in our current culture is moving us towards being users and consumers. And these great texts demand that you not approach them that way, right? So just having to slow down and read something like Confucius, you don't know what it's going to be used for. You can't sit there with Confucius and say, okay, why is this useful? What am I getting out of this? What am I supposed to get out of this? Like it counteracts everything else in your culture that's telling you to approach all of life that way. And what you don't realize it is the more that you're approaching everything with this usefulness criteria, you approach people that way, you approach parenting that way, and then suddenly some things that should be ultimately fulfilling become unfulfilling because you're misusing them, right? So many of the most beautiful things in life are useless. And when you try to put on the rubric of use, you miss what is being offered to you, right? Because you're trying to use it and it's not meant to be used. And so these texts instead, it's, if you're a busy person, well, you're probably reading a news story on your phone. Maybe put down your phone or don't read the news story or don't read the latest article that everyone's talking about, and instead spend just a few minutes reading less than 3,000 words of Frederick Douglass or Lao Tzu or somebody you've never read before. And that's an easy ask. It's not a large ask. I'm not asking that people read 500 pages of a text that they don't have the energy and the time for. But just a little bit, you're going to find is a lot more life-giving than you can even imagine, right? I think that that's true about it, but it really demands a taste or a test or, again, just an excerpt to get you started.
It was interesting you mentioned the smartphone. And when I read the section from Seneca on the shortness of life, smartphones and social media were the first thing that came to mind as perhaps a huge barrier as we think about continuing the process of becoming lifelong learners, of being contemplatives. And to quote a bit of that section, Seneca writes, "We do not have a very short time assigned to us, but we lose a great deal of it. Life is long enough to carry out the most important projects. We have an ample portion if we do but arrange the whole of it aright. But when it all runs to waste through luxury and carelessness, when it is not devoted to any good purpose, then at the last we are forced to feel that it is all over, although we never noticed how it glided away." So how do we learn in an age of smartphones? For parents, perhaps, what are some practices we can help our children establish or help ourselves establish so that we don't find ourselves experiencing what Seneca describes here as we waste our days?
Yeah, there's a lot wiser people than me on this. Andy Crouch and Amy Crouch have done such a good job with their Tech Wise books. And I know, did you read the Jonathan Haidt piece in The Atlantic on, why is
Yes.
America stupider over the last 10 years? So I do think it's true. I was hoping to try to minimalize the effects of my tools on me. So if you read, Thoreau talks about our tools should be used by us. But there comes a point in time when you find that the tools are actually using you, like they've reshaped you. And so I'm trying to minimize more and more the effect the smartphone has on me. And it's just not working. Like, like every time, just to be honest, like I've taken off social media. I've limited my phone use to an hour and it shuts down. I've tried to do everything I possibly could to minimize it. And it still has that like gravitational pull that is very scary. You talk about wasting life or losing life. And, now they have light phones. Now, they have dumb phones coming back in vogue. I just think we're going to have to be a lot more drastic if we don't want to be taken advantage of by our phones. I really do. I think we'll miss out on so much if we don't. I love that there are schools that are saying no more phones in school. I think that that's a necessary move. I think the less that we give children phones, the less they're going to be formed by them. I think in some sense we are actually disabling our children if we're making them dependent early on phones, and even ourselves. If we find ourselves dependent, if you walk out of your house and you're like, "Where's my phone? I don't have my phone." I mean, isn't that scary? Like, it's not an actual part of your body. And so I think that if we can break ourselves from that habit and we can start reading with more attention, I think we're going to find ourselves being restored to ourselves in a way that causes less anxiety and less despair, and encourages us more and strengthens us and gives us greater confidence in who we are and what we're meant to be. So I really believe that. And I think it's a great loss when we don't recognize that as truth.
Yes, it's interesting. So Jeff Bilbro's professor of literature, he introduces readings in this book by Thoreau and by Wendell Berry, but his book, Reading the Times, is such an important one to me, and a very thoughtful one on a lot of these issues as well regarding news. Yes, we have excellent books for you all to read on these topics. Yes, and Alan's books there too. And I think, he talks about this idea in Thoreau's writing of the macadamized mind, which refers to this method of road construction that focused kind of the pressing down of lots of tiny little stones to create this extremely smooth, seamless method of driving, but that lost kind of the depth, the weight that he wanted to convey in this idea of the macadamized mind, the mind that focused on trivialities instead of on deep, large concepts and ideas. And that also came to mind that with these readings, some of them are quite short, but in fact, it's within the shortness, there's such depth, and there's opportunities to perhaps continue on a process of delving into that author in greater depth, that I think is much kind of related to Thoreau's idea that we are trying to read not the times, but to read the eternities. This is perhaps a method of tasting and exploring what it means to read the eternities.
Absolutely. No, I think that's so beautifully said, and I think that's true. And that's why I love Jeff's book, because it's not talking about getting rid of reading the news, but that's that contemplation, giving you a view in which you can see the news within a larger context so that it doesn't consume your vision, right?
Mhm.
And blind you, therefore, to a right way of responding to it.
Yes, absolutely. Leah Smith asks if we can put the names of the books into the chat. So I'm going to do that really quickly. Should be You're Not Your Own. And then let's see,
Tech-wise family,
the TechWise Family.
reading the times. I have lots of books. These are some Baylor friends. We all went to grad school together. So we're similarly formed towards these things.
Yes. Oh, I love that. It's also, so that actually gets at my next question I wanted to ask. And we've probably got about 7 minutes left of discussion, and then I'd love to hear your questions. So please be thinking about that. But in the Reflections of Lao Tzu, he kind of discusses this idea of learning and of how we live in community. And I wanted to quote this and to ask you a question about education and competition, because I think what we're getting at really here is this idea of education as being something that's formed in and through community. So the quote is this: "The best of men is like water. Water benefits all things and does not compete with them. It dwells in the lowly places that all disdain, wherein it comes near to the down." So this passage struck me in part because of, I think, how competitive our educational networks and even our work environments tend to be, thinking particularly of the United States, but I know it applies in multiple other educational environments as well. So what do these readings suggest, do you think, if anything, about learning as a competitive or a cooperative environment, and how perhaps can we cultivate learning as a communal practice, even as it is also a contemplative and I think often a solitary practice?
Yeah, well, I think solitary is is partially untrue. Just to
Mm,
side note that, because even, well, one, when you used to read, everything was allowed, everything was assumed that you were in community, but the very process of reading, you're reading someone else. You're never ever alone. You're bringing the presence of another person into conversation with your own interior. And so there may be a lot that happens interiorly, but it is also happening with a tradition. It's always happening with someone else when you're reading someone else. And hopefully also you have a teacher. So this book, this was a important, I'm doing the visual because this was a very important metaphor for us. Socrates talks about feasting on discourse, and he talks about the promised banquet you receive from your students, in which he has first played host and now you are being the recipient of that meal. And so we wanted to really showcase a table in which everyone is sitting together and everyone is having a conversation together, right? That we are supposed to be in community. When we imagine what education is, it is a communal enterprise. If we can start imagining our classrooms more like banquet tables with these abundant feasts at them, rather than, as Mako Fujimura would say, like not with scarcity, not with there's only limited resources, but there's an abundance. And the more that we actually bring to the table, we receive more, which is the irony of love. It's the paradox of love that you can actually take more and then you receive more. And I think another way of recognizing what I'm talking about with community, there are really great books readers out there that are just a collection of excerpts and then they're introduced by one person. It was really important to me. So this is Marjorie Kemp. It's being introduced by Beth Allison Barr. It was important to me to grab friends and have them write the introductions and have them choose the text they wanted, because I didn't want this to be just Jake and I deciding what we love and the text that we want there, and then just two voices controlling the narrative. We wanted to invite all of our friends to really show, so the book itself actually shows you what it looks like to have a conversation, because you're hearing from someone else and then you're getting the excerpt, which is someone else, and then you're getting discussion questions that have you open it up to even more people. So everything about this was meant to be conversational. I do believe that that is a core way, like pedagogically, of making education happen, that it cannot happen well as a solitary thing.
mhm. I was actually thinking as I was reading through it, what a fun book club book this would be, especially for people who maybe have read a lot of these authors in the past, want to have a review, want to discuss them with others. It's really set up for that as well, I think. So you also include David Foster Wallace's Kenyan college commencement speech in here, in which he suggests that we don't just learn to think. There's this very common thing about classical liberal arts education that I myself have said that, oh, it taught me how to think. But he complicates that and says we should be learning, when we are learning in these environments, how to reject arrogance and how to control and direct our thoughts toward what is good. So how is the moral imagination also part of this discussion of what it means to think well and to learn and to live a good life?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons the title is so crucial. So, we really debated on the title a lot, but, learning the good life, it's not just a cerebral effort. It had to be more of an embodied thing. And that's why we did wisdom from the great hearts and minds that came before. Again, recognizing the fact that it's an imaginative, right? Heart, as well as mind that's participating in this wisdom. And we said that came before because they're not dead. They're not past, there's so Marilyn Robinson and Wendell these are also writers who are continuing this tradition. The tradition is not something that's dead and behind us. And so when you talk about the moral imagination or the good life, you're participating in it now in every decision you make, in every way that you're continuing your education, or you're choosing passive entertainment, or you're wasting time on social media, or whatever it is that you're using your time for, or throwing your energies into. And I think that's one of the reasons that Wallace's piece stands out, is that he's talking to students that you're not just minds, you're whole people. And this is why the work of like Jamie Smith is so good, imagining the kingdom, or just recognizing that our philosophical anthropology has to have this embodied sense of who we are, because what we imagine will be what we love and what we're drawn to, and that will become how we live, right? Socrates even says this, education is to love what is beautiful. Nothing in that is just a cognitive enterprise, even for Socrates, right? Who so many people accuse of being that way. But instead it was about teaching to love what is beautiful, and therefore you're crafting a good life out of what you love, right? And what
Mm,
you're pursuing.
mhm. Yes, we are at the 30-minute mark. So if you have questions, please add them. Would love to read them and to share them. Oh, we have one. Excellent. So Leah says she just finished 100 Days of Dante, and it brought the university to the whole of the people. It also was a conversation amongst Dante scholars that was fascinating. Have you thought about 100 Days for Learning the Good Life? I think it would
Oh,
be amazing.
yeah, that'd be fantastic. My colleague and I have thought about doing maybe small little podcasts where we talk to the authors about the book. So like we call Beth, and like the two of us sit down with Beth and have her do like a little spiel on Marjorie Kemp, and then have a collection of these. So yeah, we'll try to get on that this summer. This book comes out May 3rd. So Lord willing, we could get all of those done this summer and people would have that. But I did participate in the 100 Days of Dante for sure. I loved that. That was awesome.
I've been wanting to catch up in retrospect when my studies are done. Is that going to be possible, or have I missed it?
Yeah. No, it's on YouTube. I did Canto 19 of Paradiso, which is like one of my favorite cantos. But it's a great project. You can still look it all up.
Oh, I'm so excited to get to look at all of it. Um, let's see here. So I also have a question from Chance. Would you consider developing a book for high school students as well as one for younger students, I'm imagining?
So this one could be used for high school. When I taught at a classical school, I was telling Gracie earlier, I've taught elementary, junior high, and high school. And so I would teach these same excerpts easily, I would say 7th through 12th. There are several of these texts that you can discuss with any of those age groups. As far as younger, so I have another book coming out in 2023 March called Reading for the Love of God, and in the back of that I have a collection of a list of books that I would recommend nursery to 7, 7 to 12. And so I kind of give that other like more great books lists for those other ages. But the younger kids, I mean, there's really great graphic novels of Iliad and Odyssey. There's different ways of approaching the stories, but the emphasis is on the stories probably more than the actual poetry of some of these later works, or even philosophy. I'd wait for their brains to catch up to that, and really work with the grain of the student, which is invested in the stories and the images a lot more at the younger ages. So, but that's what I do with my children, and that's what we do at the school I started. So.
Mm. And Michelle asks, would love a signed copy. How can I order this? Also, will there be a replay of this on Zoom to share with family members? Yes, I am recording. And I do have a YouTube channel where I try to share the different conversations that I've had with Charles Camosi, with Joy Clarkson, and other people. And so I'll make sure to send that out through my Substack, which is granola.substack.com. So just to answer that side of things. As to the signed copy.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've been doing for both this book and Scandal of Holiness is if you can show me you're reading this with a group. So if there's at least 5 of you and send me your address, then I will send you a free signed copy. But you just have to have a proof that at least 5 of you. So there's 5 books being purchased, and I will send you the free signed copy.
Awesome. One additional question that I had, as we're kind of waiting for other questions to trickle in, is just, it seems as if it would be easy perhaps in coming to a book like this and reading some of these thinkers to believe that unless you can devote your life, for instance, to higher education, getting a PhD, studying philosophy, you're not doing it right. You're missing out on the good life. And I think we've already addressed that to some extent, but I loved that there's a reading in this book on Saint Benedict by Gregory the Great. And he observes that Benedict actually gave over his books and, quote, forsook his father's house and wealth with a resolute mind, only to serve God. And he sought to attain to the desire of his holy purpose. In this way, he departed instructed with learned ignorance and furnished with unlearned wisdom. And I loved that little excerpt and wanted to ask you, how is learning perhaps more than or different from the educational frameworks we often associate it with? And what does it mean to perhaps have learned ignorance or unlearned wisdom? And how might we seek it?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things, Karen Swallow Prior and I've had this conversation where she was talking about how the women's writers that have come before are maybe not as good in her perspective as some of the male writers that they're contemporaries because they didn't receive the same education. So I disagree. I think if we look at examples like Peter and John, are given the Holy Spirit and they speak before the Sanhedrin and they're able to have this wisdom that comes not from being educated, right? But there's wisdom of other sources that is granted to them. I think that you can see that throughout the tradition. So you can read writers such as, Julian of Norwich, who said she's uneducated or unschooled, and yet she's translating parts of the scripture herself in the showings that she gives us. There's revelations that she received that is uneducated wisdom that is offering something to the tradition that she's outside certain scholastic paradigms that might have limited her. And instead, she is able to produce a different kind of literature that gives us greater insight than maybe some of her contemporaries during the 14th century. And so I think we have to look back at some of those sources that we were not responding to. And that's also, again, what this book is about, is not just choosing the canon that we've kind of inherited, in which there were mostly white men because they were the ones receiving the education. And we look back and say, okay, what about Frederick Douglass learning all about by his own, reading, the orator, the Columbian orator, by himself in his attic and receiving this wealth of education that's different from what the educated white men during the 19th century were doing. And therefore he was able to respond differently and write differently than his contemporaries. And so I think there is a lot of unlearned wisdom or uneducated wisdom that we have to draw from. Also, in my own family, most of my family is not, they don't have PhDs, and yet they're all learning on their own, and they all are bringing wisdom to the table. I mean, my great grandfather, for example, like you talk, in Uprooted, you talk about your grandparents. My great grandfather lived on a farm and was one of 9 children and read the Bible every single day of his life. And so he had a different kind of wisdom than I will ever possess. And so I do think that there's a lot of other access. There's a lot of other ways to receive this kind of wisdom.
Yes, I love that you brought that up. My great grandfather used to memorize poetry while he was working on his tractor. That was what he would do, and then he would recite it at family gatherings, usually poetry and scripture. And I loved that. And he had this tenacious desire to keep learning and to keep exercising his mind, even in work that was very manual in a lot of ways. But Wendell Berry too, I think, talks in maybe a magazine profile I read once about how he had gone all over the world. He'd had a Guggenheim fellowship. He'd lived in Italy. He'd studied at Stanford. He'd taught at New York University. And he informed this reporter that some of the smartest and best people he'd ever met were people who had only had an 8th grade education, who he grew up with and who he loved and lived alongside in Kentucky. And so there is so much there, I think, and so much wisdom that can be learned from. Avery asks, when do you read in your routine as a mother? These texts are so deep and dense and require the kind of focus that feels impossible when toddlers are running around. And it's a question for, I think, both of us, but I'll have you start, Jessica, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah. So apart from my job reading, which is a different thing in and of itself, because I do get these breaks of time, I have 3 children and they're all under 8. And so, I'm slowly moving out of the toddler stage. My youngest is 4, but I've definitely been in that stage for a long time. This reading was so life-giving. It was so necessary to have my brain turned on because so much of it, like you said, was being used in ways that felt like I wasn't being fully me all the time. When you're walking around and your feet are squishing grapes, and when you're like cleaning up stuff and you're like, what am I doing? Where's my personhood? And so getting to just read these, even if you have to reread an excerpt again and again, even if you're just at night, you're just reading a poem and you just read the same poem all week long, you'll get more out of that poem, right? Than if you decided to go to bed early and didn't read for 5 minutes. I think for me, I had to have that. I had to be constantly listening to these things. I was listening to poems being read. You can get actually Jeremy Irons reads T.S. Eliot. That I just remember that when my kids were little, I was listening to that all the time. And that was a way of staying vigorous, I think. And that's what kept kept me feeling like myself, especially when I had 3 of them under 4. Then I needed that. So I do think that it's important to keep those routines and really prize that and protect that time.
Absolutely. I'm curious, is there going to be an audiobook version of the book?
I I don't know, actually. I'll have to check. I don't know if there's an audio of Learning the Good Life, but like I said, we will be doing some of these podcast conversations hopefully over the summer. So maybe part of that, Gracie, should be reading it if there isn't. That's a great way of telling us to do that.
Well, I asked mainly because one of the things that's helped me so much as a mom of young children is being able to listen to books when I'm doing the dishes, when I'm cleaning up as they're getting ready for nap time or in bed or whatever it might be. And I think it's something where as a mom, your hands are so often busy doing so many different things, and it's hard to sit still. You don't always have time to sit still. So I've found oftentimes listening to books to be a way for me to still incorporate them into my day-to-day schedule. And then I found I either try to wake up really, really early and to have that be time for contemplation and prayer and reading, or before bed, if not both. It depends on whether I'm up with the baby in the night, if I'm honest. But then also in the night before bed to try and read something that is dense and difficult, because what I found is when the house is quiet, I might be really tired, but I can get in several sentences. It doesn't have to even be a chapter, it can be a paragraph. And then I go to sleep thinking about something that's really thoughtful and pushing my brain in new ways and making me, and hopefully making me a bit wiser for the process of doing that reading. And so those are kind of the times I've tried to sculpt out for reading. And obviously some seasons are easier than others. But I also found I honestly did a lot of rereading last year when I had a new baby. I reread all of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and I just did some readings like that that were both solid and thoughtful, and once again had so many insights, but that were also kind of fun. And that was a really good season just to be in at that point in my mothering life.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. So Mike says there's perhaps some irony in my listening to this on my phone, but I wanted to ask about the mention of usefulness. Isn't the very purpose of a reader of excerpts to be of use?
The purpose. Well, it's also trying to train you out of it too. So yes, you want it to be useful. Augustine would say things are both useful and enjoyable. There's some things that are both. But the process is first enjoy what you're reading. And second, in a conversation, you can think about how it might be useful. But it's a matter of approaches. And so most of the time, texts are both, right? People are both. You enjoy people for who they are, and you use them for the love of God. That's Augustine. And so it's these both ands. But most of our work days or our culture is constantly just on the use, and it's not a lot of it is enjoyable, not a lot of it is leisure, not a lot of it is contemplative. And so these texts at least provide the first of just enjoy. Like I could just sit here and just read parts of, in fact I did before we started, just to kind of look back through the excerpts, and you just enjoy them for what they are. Even if you never got to the use, the enjoy is worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I was recently writing about chapter 1 of Genesis and ideas of cultivation. And I was thinking a lot about the way in which we live within ecosystems and the fact that the entire earth was actually made in such a way that we could draw benefit from our relationships with each other in a way that both signals that we are supposed to live in community and to grow in love for each other that is selfless. And that also, as a part of that selfless love, we actually benefit from each other's company, from each other's presence. And so I do love that idea of it being both that Augustine draws out, that in fact, you can both love a book for itself, you can love learning for its own sake, and it's cultivating something in you, it's growing you in ways that then make you a better human being. Um, Danielle asks, what are 3 books that you consider essential?
So a few years ago, I was asked to write a list for 10 books everyone should read before they graduate college. And the first 3 of those would be my essentials. So The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, Dante's Divine Comedy, and Augustine's Confessions. So those are my top 3. And then, of course, the list is longer for the top 10. But and there's excerpts of those in this Learning the Good Life too. So
Oh, those are such great books. I don't even know if I can answer. I would love to be able to, but my brain, whenever I'm asked for favorite books, it goes off in a million different directions. I do have to say that Dostoevsky, that Brothers Karamazov would have to be on that list for me as well. I would be tempted to also put Lord of the Rings on there. I feel like there should be some philosophy. Undoubtedly for me, there would be Wendell Berry, but we can stop there. Mary asks, what are the other books I think that you put on that
Oh,
list?
this was a few years ago. So let me see. Douglas's Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which I just love. I love all 3 of his autobiographies. I find them so inspiring. One of the main reasons that I think Douglas is inspiring right now to our current culture reminds me a lot of Ray Bradbury. And I know that sounds like a weird jump, but Douglas talks about when he was learning to read, and his master told the woman teaching him to read, which was the master's wife, that reading will make him unfit to be a slave. And that was so eye-opening to me when I was in high school, and even now, because what about the inverse then? If we're not reading, are we enslaved? And if so, to what? And so I think about it in terms of Bradbury, like how much our culture is enslaving us because we've given up or forsaken the reading life. So Frederick Douglass's narrative is essential for trying to see yourself as being free from the forces in this world that are maybe trying to enslave you. Solzhenitsyn, I'm a huge Solzhenitsyn fan. My last book was Solzhenitsyn. So Ivan Denisovich is the most easy and accessible of his works, but In the First Circle is probably my favorite. But Solzhenitsyn's on that list. Flannery O'Connor, complete works, because I don't want to pick one. So I'm also an O'Connor scholar, so like her complete works are necessary. I think Hopkins was on that list because he's my favorite poet. I go back and forth between Hopkins and Eliot and Anna Akhmatova and Osip Mandelstam. I love all of their poetry. County Cullen, Claude McKay. I have a ton of poets. If I could get like a collection of poetry to always take with me everywhere I go, I think that's necessary. So Christian Wyman a few years ago did a poetry collection called Joy. So if you get one poetry collection, I would get that one, because especially when things feel like they're full of grief or full of darkness, that collection on joy is really good. So I can't remember all the rest of them, but those are some of the ones that come to mind right off the top of my head.
Oh, such good books.
You can,
Yeah.
yeah, you can find the list. I mean, I think it's still out there. It's 10 books to read before you graduate college.
Mm. I think one of my professors had that in undergrad and sent it to us, and I loved I think the complete works of Jane Austen were on that list as well, which we all learned so much from studying those books together.
Yeah.
So one question, you finished the book. So the book has these essays, these excerpts, these beautiful poems, each introduced by a different scholar. And then you finish the book with prayers and liturgies for students. So why should we pray before we learn? What does the habit of prayer teach us about what it means to learn, to study, and to read the right way?
Yeah. So I prayed before this webinar began. I pray before I do any webinar or any talk or any class that I'm teaching, because it reminds me of, again, that telos, that when we talk about the contemplative life, what is this action for? And I think prayer stops us from continuing through the actions without pausing and saying, what are they for? And so prayer is an invitation and a reminder physically, especially if you pray audibly, to say, like, this is what this is for. And Lord, may it be so that this is what this is for. And so these prayers are throughout the tradition. It's Thomas Aquinas prayers, Samuel Johnson, Howard Thurman, Flannery O'Connor, Bonhoeffer, and all the way up to Doug McElvey, who works at the Rabbit Room. He publishes the Rabbit Room, and he let us include his prayer for students. So again, we wanted to keep in mind that the tradition is continuing. It doesn't stop It is not static. And so we have a lot of living authors that are also in this as well. So I do think the necessity of praying before we do things moves us towards that view of contemplation. And for Jake and I both, really thinking about learning as a practice, as an embodied thing, as something that you do in community, and getting away from the mindset that learning can be an individualistic or self-improvement endeavor.
Mm-hmm. I've gotten to be a part of a wonderful group here at Oxford called the Scriptorium. And so on the days that we meet, we get together in the morning and we share our goals for the day, and we pray the Scholar's Prayer together, kind of to start everything off. And then after every 1.5 hour block of study time, we come back together and we discuss what we've been working on, and we hold each other accountable and have some tea and coffee, and then we go back to work again. But I've found praying that prayer to start our day all together, thinking about then how we go about our work and seeking the work of the Holy Spirit to have the lucidity to comprehend, to be able to approach very difficult work together, and with the help of God, has been something that's been really beautiful, and I've found, I think, will continue to transform the way I think about what it means to study even.
Yeah, these things used to be a lot more connected than they are now. Like if you look back at the start of education, either if you look in, Morocco was the first university started by a Muslim woman who actually inherited a fortune, and she started, but it was very much directed towards God. Like learning had this higher end. And then the scholastic, the monastic the monastic schools, and then the scholastic universities that grew out of that. Like all of these began with the idea that it was a community coming together towards growing in knowledge towards God, right? Like it was this ascendant endeavor. And so the life of prayer and then the life of action in your love of your neighbor and the acts of mercy with the things you were reading, those were all connected. They were not supposed to be divided up into, okay, we have Sunday worship and we have daily education and then we have our jobs and we have our work. Like it was about a life. And I think the more that education can get back to that, you're going to have less people concerned about, what education is for, and not having to ask these kind of basic questions again, because they're going to be practicing it. They're going to feel what education is for, and they're going to feel lost if they don't have it. Whereas right now, I think because education doesn't look like that, people are like, wait, what is this for? Why are we doing this? And so we've lost the purpose and we've lost the practice.
Yes. We have about 8 minutes left, and so we have another thought here on how Bruce Springsteen is our greatest modern American poet. These insights fit within that,
Yeah.
which I think, my final question, but I'd love for anybody else to share if they have some final thoughts. Where do you hope readers will go from here? After reading this book, what are some other books or authors that you would recommend for the next steps?
Yeah, well, what I'm hoping first, and I would say there's lots of directions to go. What I would be hoping first is that you go and find the whole sources for some of these materials. So, if you really enjoyed reading this excerpt from Augustine, you go read all of Confessions, or this excerpt from David Foster Wallace or Bonhoeffer, that you go and read the entirety of those authors, because I think there's so much to be known by reading the whole work. And so I highly prize the whole work first. I think secondarily, like if you want this kind of defense of what education could look like if that is what you hear from this conversation and you're wanting to go another direction, two more books I'm just going to hold up. So Lost in Thought, Zena Hitz, or Breaking Bread with the Dead, Alan Jacobs. These are more of going back to this idea of contemplation as education. Probably the source of those ideas to go back to the older text would be the 1950s, Leisure as the Basis of Culture, Joseph Pieper. He has some other books. We include excerpts from this in our book as well. And then, if you're also wondering how you connect reading to the good life, Karen Swallow Prior on reading well. My friend Claude Acho has a book coming out in May called Reading Black Books, about how the church should be reading African-American literature. I wrote a book this last March that came out, and it's called The Scandal of Holiness. it's connecting reading great fiction, kind of the fun readings you were talking about, Lord of the Rings. It was hard not to write this whole book on Lord of the Rings. But just what are the fun novels that also inspire us to have these lives that are these adventures in sanctity, right? And so, yeah, so those are some of the other books I think I'd recommend. But again, I have a book coming out next year that'll have a whole book list in the back. But
Yes, I missed the name of one of those authors. Was it Reading Black Books? And you said it's not out yet?
Reading Black Books comes out in May, and it's by Claude Atcho, Atcho. That's gonna be. I endorse that one. That's a great book.
Awesome. Oh, so many great resources. Yes. And I was going to say too that with the excerpts from this book, there's everything from Plato all the way to Marilyn Robinson. There's philosophy, there's poetry, there's Gerard Manley Hopkins. There's so many different things to delve into. And I think one of the things that was really exciting about it for me was to even just remind myself, oh, I've always wanted to read more of this author and I haven't done it yet. Why haven't I done it yet? So my reading list has also grown in the process.
Well, some of them I had never read Sor Juana Inez de la Cruz. I had not read her until this. I had not read John Comenius, like never even heard of John Comenius until David I. Smith, who did our foreword for it, right? And I revere him as an educator, and he was like, you have to have Comenius in here. I'm like, do we? That's great. So I think this book is also an introduction to this great conversation where you can get these other resources and read the whole text. So now actually I've started a book club meeting in a few weeks. We're going to read the Book of the City of Ladies by the 14th century work by Christine de Pizan. So I'd only read excerpts of that. Again, excerpts, they become this gateway into the larger text. So
Yes. Leah asks, do you think there needs to be a different collection for those who are not young? How might the practice be tweaked for older adults?
No, I don't think so. So the aim for this was first year students, but in that sense, we're aiming it at adults, right? So this is kind of an entry to this great conversation. It's not aimed as a teenage text. I think we don't expect enough of teenagers. So I'm saying you could teach this in high school because I think we too often infantilize our high school students. And I think we can expect that they can engage these texts. From my practice teaching junior high and high school, I very much think that they could practice reading these texts and enjoying them. But all great texts should be able to be read at all ages, right? C.S. Lewis says that even if you think a young book, right, is only good for young readers, it was probably never even good for the young readers. You probably shouldn't be reading it at all. So I do believe these books are not aimed at too low of an audience for anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and actually that makes me think about G.K. Chesterton being in here, who also has, I think, some wonderful thoughts about the role of fairy tales throughout our lives, and George MacDonald, whose works I think I've realized as I read them to my children, I enjoy more than when I read them the first time around. So I think it goes both ways, doesn't it? We learn from the text we read when we were children, and hopefully as we grow into adulthood, we're reading things that will continue to be wonderful for the rest of our lives.
Well said.
Thank you. Well, it's been such a delightful hour, and I want to thank everyone for joining us, for the thoughtful comments and questions. I'm really excited to hear what you end up reading, both as you consider this book and its excerpts and as you use it to kind of consider other great texts. So to kind of finish, Jessica, where can people find you? And maybe what's something that you will be reading this week?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I'm reading Christine de Pizan. So I'm in the middle of In the Book of Ladies. I just finished Evelyn Waugh's Helena, also really good. It's a great novel about the 3rd century mother of Constantine, the emperor. So those are, I'm always finishing something, reading something new, and have a whole plan for things that I'm going to read in the future. You can find me on Twitter at Hooten Wilson. And also, of course, I have a website and I have a Substack too that only goes out monthly because I can't do any more than that. And nobody wants to read any more than that from me. So
Perfect. I have the same. Granola is a monthly newsletter, and you can find it at granola.substack.com. And I'm on Twitter at Gracy Olmstead, Gracy with a Y, Grecy. So thank you everyone so much for joining us. And I will be posting this, so hopefully you can share it with others. And everybody have a wonderful day.